who I actually am, what I've actually done here at Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago, but I have chosen not to go by that when it comes to my artistic endeavors. There's a couple reasons for that. I mean, the biggest of which is privacy. As you can see with this whole getup, that now I'm kind of like practicing here what the persona of Sapphy Lore is, so thank you for giving me the space to do that. And I'll be doing that a little bit more later on the year, but I've also, just in general, there's this artistic, the artistic drive to make sure that people are aware that it's a parasocial relationship when you encounter my work. The idea that if you read my book and you know what I've written and you follow my socials, you only get to know, you're only knowing a one side of me, not the whole side of me, and that's a whole thing. If we want to get into that in Q&A, we could talk about that more later. But I am a podcaster, first with this name, as Kara mentioned. My husband and I do a podcast called Lore Together. We talk about the storytelling in video games. In particular, a lot of the characters and world building. Most of the time, my husband, Mystic, is the one who will actually talk about the story itself, and I'm riffing on it. We do switch back and forth every once in a while from that. I'm a game master, tabletop RPGs. Essentially, if you know what Dungeons & Dragons are, a lot of dice, pen and paper, and collaborative storytelling together. A game master is usually one who knows the world and the plot. So essentially, I kind of weave that together. And now I'm finally endeavoring into where my next journey with my creativity, I should say, as an author. And that's kind of where I want to talk about. As Kara mentioned, I've been writing since a very young age. My mother has saved the little stories I wrote for audience in second grade, where I would read it out loud to the class, third grade actually, loud to the class, and they wanted to know the chronicles of these adventure dogs that I had created. And I just never really let go of that passion. Being a game master involves a lot of like writing and storytelling as well. So that's what I'm here to talk about. So when I talk about the two books I've written, I like to talk about the things that have just been cooking in the Rolodex of ideas in my head for the last, I'd say probably like whole life almost. And the way I see it is when you get a story idea, you know, a lot of people will think there's this eureka moment where you hear something and you decide you're going to flip it on its edge. But it's usually a combination of multiple things. And to talk about the first book that I released, I want to briefly go through the journey with you about that. So you'll see reference to your Star Trek: The Next Generation, very specifically Data. And that is a show I grew up watching when I was a kid with my mother, and that was some of our bonding time. And Data in particular was a really intriguing idea of a machine with personhood. The idea that you have to acknowledge the fact that even if they're not organic, they have, are different than you, that there's still a sense of an idea of humanity within them. So I always grew up with that concept possibly being true in the future, probably a future I would never see. My mother has always been a science fiction fan, and so a couple of the books that she had on her bookshelf I ended up reading as I got older. Isaac Asimov, if anybody knows him, he has an extensive history writing about very particularly stories on artificial intelligence. Now we're talking about artificial intelligence as we talked about it like 10 or so years ago, when it was really the idea of a thinking, creating thing. And it's different than how marketing has used it to talk about AI models now. So it's not artificial intelligence as we talk about it when it comes to ChatGPT. This is artificial intelligence in more in the terms of how we talk about data. In that book, The Naked Sun, is a mystery where, as much as I don't really like mysteries, there was a really cool concept of a human detective working with a android detective who could pass for human, as long as you weren't expecting him to emote. So that's always been something I found really intriguing. On the other end of the spectrum for science fiction, The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin was my first foray into her fiction, and she's really good at bringing out these, kind of how I've described myself now, these really extremely unique settings and then, bringing the human response to it, and multiple human responses at the same time, and how they're natural even if they're flawed. And The Lathe of Heaven's a really good example of that, especially when the main character is kind of brought in a situation where he doesn't realize he's being taken advantage of, and it takes this attorney that he meets really moving forward with that. Getting back to the idea of artificial intelligence, as time went on and I got more into video games, my husband Mystic got me more into them, the idea of artificial intelligence came back in this video game series Mass Effect, where if you saw my talk last year where I was talking about storytelling in video games, you might have heard me talk about a lot because it's a series I always go back to. The picture you see there, the little bulb, is actually a character named Edie, who is an artificial intelligence. And one of the things I liked that Mass Effect did really well was how they did artificial intelligence being separate from what's called virtual intelligence. And virtual intelligence in that world is a lot more what we're talking about when it comes to the large learning models that are being advertised as artificial intelligence. It is an amalgamation of certain parameters that can seem very natural, but is really just a calculator of averages for whatever your prompt or question is. And Edie is artificial intelligence, which in this universe is illegal to create because once you make something that has, sentience and sapience, it has rights. So they don't want you creating a race of people to essentially subjugate them in the future just because they're machines. That's a whole other plot point in that series as well. And then lastly, not necessarily science fiction related, and not even a picture of me, I didn't, because of the whole privacy thing, I didn't want to show a picture of myself and my mother's face, but a good representation of the difference between how I look and how my mother looks is this picture of Rashida Jones with her dad, Quincy Jones. And that's the color difference between my mother and I. And ever since I was a very little girl, I was very aware of how things were perceived when we were together and how we weren't seen as family, even though we were family. And that will bring us to the very interesting last bit of inspiration that kind of culminated in all this. Election night 2016. That was a very interesting time for me when I realized the people who I thought were my peers as countrymen were not actually my peers. My peer group got very small November 2016, and having to react to that and understand what that meant was kind of also a point for me to reflect and realize what are my opportunities to help I am a Black woman with passing privilege. It is my culture. It is what I grew up with. How do I acknowledge that and practice allyship? And it's a problem that I've always reckoned with to a certain extent, but really in 2016 it came, right out the gate. This is your plight now. Sorry, this is what you have to deal with. And there are some other ways that I tried to answer it, but there were certain things I didn't want to do. I didn't want to be basically the ambassador to two different cultures. That seemed unnecessary and a lot more forgiveness given than needs to be. And I didn't want to, what was I going to say? I honestly just didn't want to become the face of any movement as well, because I am an outlier when it comes to the Black experience. Passing privilege is a huge privilege. There's a big deal to it. So as I'm looking at the world I'm in, racking my brain, trying to think about how my identity fits with what my values are in this world, I then proceed to, a year later, decide I want to do what's called NaNoWriMo. So National Novel Writing Month was something for a long time where the idea was if either you're starting it or even in the middle of your work, the idea is to try to get 50,000 words in 1 month. And I started it before, but I never finished it. In 2017, I was like, this is the year. I'm going to finish it. What I'm going to write on? Well, basically what the last two slides were all about. Now, you could write about, what I'm thinking about in terms of like a memoir or a modern fiction, but that was not anything that I gravitated to. For me, I always felt like if I'm going to examine an idea deeply, I'm going to have to put some distance to it from myself. And science fiction is a really great way to do that. I like being able to take an idea of what's happening in the real world and take one part of it I want to examine, and then from there, work out the idea within the plot and the story and focus on that part in a unique setting where we're not trying to necessarily say how things have to be here now, but just a thought experiment on what could be factors of what's happening now. And I think science fiction has always been really good at being commentary for modern issues, which is why, if you haven't noticed, the common joke online right now is that so a lot of our problems are rich people reading science fiction and not really realizing the lesson was don't do what happened in the book. Let me get a drink of water here. So, with that, I did an outline. Now, at this point, I didn't do a typical outline. I kind of just did an outline where I just put a little plot points like, okay, this scene's going to happen, and after that happens, then we have to go to this plot point. Very loose, very much like just a pathway for me to write through and kind of get to it. And by the end of November 2017, I had just a little over 50,000 word story, and that was draft 1. So what ended up being my first published book became three drafts of work. So the first draft was basically the NaNoWriMo goal, but it was not at the word count that you would even have at the low end for a novel. And science fiction novels even expect more. You know, the average novel is anywhere from about 70 to 100,000 words. In science fiction, you can even get away with 120,000 words for a standalone novel because there's an expectation of having to develop a lot of your world and the situation at hand. The beginning was pretty strong. It starts with a young mother with her infant son who's immigrating under an alias to a planet colony far away from Earth, and the first line is, "I want to go back to Earth." She wants to go back home. And the reason she ends up getting in this situation is because a combination of her professional expertise as a programmer, along with her, along with her desire to raise more funds to make it back home faster, she's put into this predicament of finding out a secret she never wanted to find. So the concepts were really good, but something didn't feel right when I wrote it. Something didn't quite click the way I thought it should, so I ended up giving it to a friend of mine who was willing to give me what's called a developmental edit. A developmental edit, for those of you who may be unaware, is an edit where you essentially tell the editor, hey, tell me how much my plot works. Tell me how much this path works. And they come back and they let you know, this character is weak, this turn makes no sense. And a lot of his comments were, and especially the stuff that stuck me was, your ending falls really, really flat. It's just not working the way that it is. And I had to agree with him at that point. It got lost in this idea of like an arbitration court with aldermen, and it got really wordy and long for no reason. And then Virginia doesn't really have a lot of things at stake. Near the end, she's just kind of existing while other exciting things happen in a scene that you don't get to read about. So I was like, all right, thank you for this. So then soon after that, with a lot of enthusiasm, I get to draft 2. It's now finally at proper novel length, over 70,000 words. The plot is now a little stronger. The themes are definitely dialed in better. The conflict is there. Virginia is actually having to really, deal with the tension of her personal wants, but also the rights of what she discovers to be androids with sentience and sapience that has been, taken away from them within their own coding. almost kind of like what she describes as a digital lobotomy. And how is she supposed to reckon with this? And if she does reckon with it, what does she actually sacrifice at that time? So it becomes this, it became a much more compelling path to read and follow. But what happened in draft 2 was just a little lack of that, I say, the emotional oomph. And I was pretty sure I was almost there, but I wanted to get it a little bit boost. But then life happened. I ended up moving to Chicago in 2019, out from the suburbs, you know, and then end of 2019, realized I'm pregnant with my now son, and I'm like, oh, 2020 is gonna be my year. We don't need to answer if it was. We all know it wasn't. And then it takes a while before we get to draft 3. And I'll tell you how we got to draft 3 because the second book kind of pulls into that. But draft 3, once I finally got to it, was still at a really good length. Actually just under 80,000 words, if I'm honest. The plot was a little tighter. I gave it to a good friend of mine for a sensitivity read, which I can explain a little bit more in a bit. And then because I was willing, and at that point, I think partly, you know, dare I say, the scars of 2020 have made me more radically vulnerable to who I am emotionally. And that helped tap into where Virginia was and what she was sacrificing. And near the end, we give her a chance to realize what she's risked and what that means and what she's gonna lose. And that oomph that I was missing before was there. But there's this gap between 2018 and 2023 for those drafts, and I'm gonna explain basically what happened in between creatively, which first was a drought. But during that drought, again, as I said before, a lot of things are just collecting in my head over the years. And this is how we get to what's going to be book 2. You're going to see a lot more inspiration here, and it's going to make sense in a bit. And I'll try to go through it very quickly. But we're going to rewind back to when I was younger in middle school, and I usually never got into fantasy. I was like, oh, I don't care about lords, I don't care about castles, I don't want to be saved by a knight, that's gross. But I ended up finding friends who had stories that they really liked and enjoyed. And they were written by Tamora Pierce. And here you'll see the last book of her quartet called The Immortals, where there is a character who's named Verilla Dane. And she is a reluctant hero. She has to do the right thing because she's the only person who can do it. And it turns out near the end, she has a divine parentage that she was unaware of. And I found it really compelling. So so that was something where I always wanted to write something about that. Around the same time, I also found myself inspired from civilizations outside of what I was taught in school. I did not know until, right before high school, the importance of Mesoamerican civilizations and cultures. So you'll see that in the corner right there. They were so far advanced compared to Europe during the Middle Ages. I'm not even getting into all of it because it's so hard to explain. I mean, everybody remembers the Aztecs, which they didn't even call themselves the Aztecs. That's a story for another day. As the guys where the Spaniards wrote about them ripping hearts out of chests. But there's a whole sophisticated civilization who was able to sustain the large cities with a really interesting hierarchy structure. And it was really good for me to learn about that. Other media that was inspiring me at the time, I had an anime phase. If you don't know anime, Japanese animation, very specific style, actually inspired by Betty Boop and that artistry back in the 30s. You got Astro Boy, and then you got a whole genre of storytelling. And when I was in high school, I was watching stuff like Escaflowne. Escaflowne is like a basically pulled out of your daily world into the real world kind of story, where the main character, Hitomi, is a teenage girl who's brought to this place, and it turns out that she is, being from Earth, she's from what's called the Mystic Moon. She has special powers. Yes, there's 2 boys that she's totally like crazy for. She has to decide which one she wants to smooch more than the other. Total like 16-year-old girl, like grab you with her heartstrings kind of stuff. But one of the things I found really compelling on that was the plot about a moon and divinely respecting a moon. So throughout high school, I write this trilogy. Now, I'm going to say, I think I was a decent writer for my age, but I was definitely writing at my maturity level. So it had a lot of flaws, but it had some good elements too. And it was about a pair of divinely blessed women who were trying to bring their two different faith systems together, because it turned out that the two gods they were worshiping separately actually were a partnership of creation. And they were going to fight off this lizard people force based on Gila monsters. They're really cool looking monsters. So I ended up writing that, and then Dungeons and Dragons was also in my life, and by college I was running Dungeons and Dragons games, and what my campaign was the sequel to that whole story, that whole thing. And yeah, I won't get into all the details of it, but it was a 3-year journey with a good group of friends, really good collaborative storytelling, surprisingly mature group of friends. And that sequel ended up bringing out some interesting points with characters, part of which was developed with ideas from the characters that my friends were playing in that game. We ended it at the end of my senior year, really satisfying ending. I will never have a campaign that smooth ever again, and you know what? I accept that. Sometimes life just can only throw you a win that good once. As I get older and I get more into video games and I keep leaning into the nerd side of me, I find myself inspired by things like the Dragon Age video game series that is a dark fantasy setting. And a lot of it is about not only divine elements, but as the series continues, you find out that how twisted the divine is for their own personal interests, and how they weren't actually divine, but they have claimed themselves to be divine because they were so powerful. And the first one, Dragon Age Origins, introduced me to this idea of an adventuring structure of 4 adventurers. And you'd be your one character, and you choose different companions that you could game with. A lot of storytelling video games do this, where you have more than one companion that travels with you with different powers and everything. So I start writing in that, I start playing that game, and I keep that idea of like a quartet in my head. And as time goes on, I'm keeping up with Dungeons and Dragons. If you don't know Critical Role, it is one of the most famous live play of Dungeons and Dragons. It's just a bunch of voice actors being theater kids playing Dungeons and Dragons. Is actually insanely compelling. And the third campaign that I was watching in 2023 once again had a divine moon plot, and I was like, oh yeah, that's a pretty common theme, isn't it? And it just kept coming back. Then around finally the fall of 2023, I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3. It's literally based on Dungeons and Dragons rules. Video game, very crunchy, very detailed. If you're not into video games and you want to get started, don't start there. There's a lot of moving parts with that game and how it's done. But it had a really compelling character named Gale, who's a wizard, who's kind of cursed. I was playing a barbarian character, and in these games, you can romance your companions if you decide to. And I just decided for that barbarian, it was like, okay, she should be with this wizard, because that's such a weird pairing, right? This barbarian woman who's mostly about strength and instinct with this very well-studied, we're verbose kind of mage. And then something about that story just stuck in my craw. I couldn't let go of it. There was something about it that just, every time I was idle thinking, I was like, well, what if we did this with the story? Or what if they did that? Well, that mage probably would have another mage friend, right? And what would they be doing? Why would they be meeting each other? How would they be? And then suddenly that crashes with the whole world I made for the D&D campaign, that sequel to my high school trilogy. And this flood of inspiration hits me in November of 2023. And so I said, okay, I got to write this down. This is going to be a good book. I'm in a really good place now. I have the free time and everything. What I thought would be one book, after I outlined it, even when I outlined it, It was a 45-page outline, highly detailed. You can see a picture of it there. So this is kind of an outline style that's done by people like James Patterson has done some classes on this, like if you go to the master class. And a friend introduced me to this after he took it. The idea is you basically you write out the chapter by chapter, and you have details. So you have essentially a very rigid plan of where you should go. So I start with that first to make sure I know where I'm going before I start writing it. 45 pages later, I have 79 chapters with a prologue and an epilogue, and I still convinced myself this was going to be one book. So I start writing December 2nd, and I keep going, and I'm telling friends, and I'm obsessed. I mean, to the point where I'm like, you know, my husband's coming out where my son's playing in the living room with like Bluey on in the background. And there I am writing. He's like, aren't you going to spend any time with your kid? I said, I did, but also I just need to get this page done. I need to get this scene done. It was obsessive. Every night, if I hadn't written yet, I wrote something. Every day from December 2nd to October 8th, 2024, I wrote at least 2 sentences every day. Motivated by the fear that I wouldn't finish. There was something about this story where I knew it had to be told, so I wanted to get this done. And it wasn't until about like the end of January when I started that a friend was looking over the outline with me and everything, and she goes, okay, so when you get to about this place here, this is actually a good place to break for the next book, right? And I freeze. I'm like, next book, what are you talking about? She goes, you have more than one book here. And I had to look at it, and by that point, I had typed about 70,000 words, I think, at that point. And I said, oh, you're right. I have more than one book here. But I kept going. I wasn't going to, and she was trying to tell me, if you need to a break because you're burning out, take a break. And I went the opposite direction. I don't need a break. I need to get this done. It needs to be done right now. My heart needs it done. So we get through it. As you can see, it was, for obvious reasons, what became book 1 and book 2 essentially was written pretty quickly. There are not a lot of words. Book 3 dragged on a bit more, not only because it was longer, much longer, but there was a lot of different family stuff going on, including, unfortunately, in April 2024, I lost my grandfather, and those things take a toll, and grieving needed to come first. But I still every day wrote at least a couple sentences. I usually would, on the days I wasn't sure I could write anything, would at least get a paragraph out. So within 10 months, I get almost 440,000 words done. And I have the first draft of an entire trilogy. And I look at that, and I'm very proud, and I had next steps that I knew what I needed to do. I had to figure out, where I was going to divide things. I was going to start editing stuff for what would be the first book. And then this thought in my head goes, wait, but you still have your sci-fi novel. And my heart still had a place for it. It still felt like a good story. It still felt like it needed to be told. And around that same time, when I was telling other people I was writing this book, a friend of mine from work, who if you end up reading the sci-fi novel, is mentioned in the back of the book, Alexis, she offered to read it. And near the end of this process, I tell her, hey, so did you realize that now you're going to be a beta reader? Which a beta reader is somebody who reads a story and gives their feedback, kind of a way to get a developmental edit more from an idea of what the reader's perspective. And she was like, wait, what do I have to do for that? And I said, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you were doing that, but now you're doing that for me. So I give her what at the time the working title at first was Nia and Her Sons, and what became Mother Revolution. And she is the one that helped me realize there was an emotional oomph. Got another friend for the sensitivity read because the androids are non-binary, wanted to make sure I wasn't doing any stereotypical stuff with that. And then finally, it's time. And I'm in a rush to get it out because I'm too excited. So, with only giving about 2 weeks for people to get excited and pre-order and know what's going on with the book, I decided I'm going to do independent publishing, because in the past I'd query for stories. In fact, I queried for this one a couple years before, and I only sent it to 2 places, and just having that much rejection was just not feeling right. So I took a break from it, and part of the reason I did my pause. For with independent publishing, everything's on you to get it done, but you have a lot more power and control of how the story is going to be told, how you're going to sell it, who you'd like your audience to be, how you curate your audience. And that worked for me because I had a whole vision with it. So January 30th, Mother Revolution was published and out and ready for consumption. Would you risk it all to protect the lives of those unaware of their chains? And I get to tell the story of Virginia with her baby Oshkosh on the colony of Kakari, trying to figure out how to get back to Earth under her alias because of what she left behind on the first space colony she had ever went to from Earth. A bounty hunter finds her and tells her, you can get money from me for this side job. However, if you don't do it the way I ask you to, I'm going to turn you back into where you ran away from. What she initially thinks of as a virus in this set of androids that are called Perseus turns out to actually be subjugating their free will. And from there, she wrestles with the idea of how does she help them. So that got published in January. There's a few things I am going to be doing differently in the future that I learned from this process. I think I'm really proud of the story. I was able to get somebody to proofread it too, which I think even if you're going to do independent publishing, always have a proofreader at minimum, so at least people understand what you're trying to write. But I only gave myself 2 weeks of lead time, which meant I didn't really get a lot of fanfare to build up with it. I didn't really get to build up an audience for it. I didn't get a chance to get what are called ARC copies out, an advanced reader copy. And what you do with an ARC is you send it to people who are known to post reviews, like on Amazon or other sites. Goodreads, Storygraph, and Fable are newer ones now. And you can ask them to send a review, so that way people who read the genre that you're writing in can hopefully either suggest or even sometimes honestly say this wasn't for me. But the more reviews you have out there, the better. And then with that short amount of time frame, I also didn't give myself a chance to release the digital copy with the paperback copy. Things were delayed. And I also have this really bad habit of being super modest. So I'm really bad at marketing. So I had to learn a lot about self-marketing for when you're self-published, what that entails, what you should consider, what's too expensive, what's not, avoid vanity presses and all of that stuff. So with the lessons I learned with Mother Revolution and actually now having technically 3 other books waiting to be published, I was like, all right, the first one is out. I feel good about this. I would have felt bad if I'd published the other story first, because Mother Revolution had a very special place in my heart. Starting first as a story, I was like, oh, I'll write this and I'll query and I'll see if anybody needs me to change anything, to becoming my baby, where I was like, no, this story has to be told this way. And then knowing I felt that same way about my trilogy, I went ahead and decided I'm going to do things the way you're supposed to as an indie author. So I've started talking about it on my socials as Project Whole Cloth. I'm reading this much. I'd get progress and stuff, and slowly building a little bit of an audience online. And then finally I got to the point where I'm like, all right, we're ready. Let's reveal this. And today is the day I reveal to the public what the actual title is of the first book. So, my fantasy trilogy's first book is Hidden Root. It will be book 1 of the trilogy series. It's called The Injured Tapestry. And in that story, the amalgamation of all that inspiration I mentioned a few slides ago is telling the story of 2 different characters. You have Brave Keeley, a warrior from what is called the Stone Isles, and then you have Mage Rock, a fire mage that is from an evil empire across the mountain range, but is an exile to the Everwarm Kingdom. And through them, they are half of what becomes a group of 4 who are selected by the king for some of his last orders as what's called the king's dagger, a precise cut to things that soldiers and scribes cannot solve. And through their adventures, they do not realize that they are uncovering essentially a divine plan to rectify something that's broken within their world. Because previously, the heroes that had been divinely blessed were thwarted because free will trumps fate in their world. And because free will trumps fate, because it supersedes it, that means sometimes the best laid plans can be undone with one simple tug by a mortal not knowing they're messing with the wrong thing. And in this book, they begin to do what should have been done years before by those who had all the gifts. They'll fix what destiny couldn't. And that is pretty much my journey. So to end everything off, this is how I got to basically at the point where I'm going to be releasing 2 books this year. And now we're going to try to fix the modesty thing now. So if you would like to support me, I have a newsletter. If that website looks messy, just go to loretogether.com/Sapphy-Lore, and you'll have a link up top where you can do it. I am also on Threads and Instagram at Sapphy Lore. I'm on Blue Sky at sappylore.bsky.social. Bsky is a lot more of the little less posts, a little more profesh, and Threads is just me usually spouting off my opinions, including ones that are not necessarily related to my work, but are actually more related to the indie author community. You can always listen to my podcast, Lore Together. You can take a bookmark. I have bookmarks for both books today, including there's going to be a sale during a convention I'm going to called Gen Con for Mother Revolution. So you'll be able to get it for 99 cents between July 31st and August 4th, wherever you prefer to get your digital ebooks. And then if you would like to pre-order a signed copy of Mother Revolution, that's why the signs are out there today. They were supposed to be here by today, however, logistics decided to just shoot me in the foot, so they're coming to my house tomorrow. If you would like, probably easiest is for me to deliver it here with your name, and I'll give you a signed copy of Mother Revolution, my debut novel. If you would rather order it directly to your home yourself, you can always order it. I always suggest bookshop.org if you want the paperback copy. Or I just finally got listed for my first indie bookstore who's online called Paperbacks and Fry Bread, an indigenous woman who owns a indie bookstore that is highlighting voices for minority populations. So it's listed under there as a black sci-fi. But yeah, so buy my book. And I just want to thank everybody for sitting through and listening to my journey.
Thanks so much, Sapphy. In just a minute, we'll have a chance to ask some questions, but in the meantime, we're going to have a musical interlude during which you can think of the questions you may want to ask. And we also suggest that you make a contribution. You can make contributions at our website. You could also, we have a QR code now that you can scan up here or at the back. And we also have a basket by the door. And it's through our generosity that we can show how meaningful programs like this are. We suggest a donation of $10, but any amount or no amount at all is absolutely fine. We're grateful for everyone who sustains the society in whatever way through their generous donations of time as well as money. So go ahead and think of your questions and get ready to line up at the microphone.
questions?
I think we are ready. I see a couple folks lined up for questions, so I'll invite Sapphy back up to the stage.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. I'm curious about your experience in world building.
Yeah.
How much of the world was set for you before you started going into plot, and how much of it emerged as a result of plot?
I would say for me personally, almost when you do the plot, you have to figure out the world that can exist in first. So I do that first, and then from there I figure out other logistics from that. So for example, with Mother Revolution, I had to put Virginia in a setting where she was going to have a lot of high stress. So she had to be an immigrant. Well, what are the rules for being an immigrant when you two have an interplanetary travel and you're on a colony and you're trying to use an alias so that the cops at your home planet, so to speak, don't get you. So I had to figure out what rules made sense, what are the differences? Why would she choose this planet? Is this planet different from other planets? Which the answer was yes. And the book kind of goes into that a little bit. And like, how much of a selection could she have? And also had to figure out, so in this world, why would there be incentive to not have, to not acknowledge artificial intelligence? Well, Virginia ends up explaining in the book that on Earth, they've outlawed the idea of what is, I like to now call it like artificial sentience instead, since artificial intelligence has been co-opted as a marketing term. But so there's a precedent of essentially acknowledging that artificial intelligence is not a good idea because you end up making slaves. That's not good. And so at this point, Earth, and this is an idealized version of Earth where we've learned about all our sins in the future and we have figured our stuff out a lot better, got rid of that. But the further you go from Earth, those furthest reaches of those colonies that are isolated, they kind of don't have the luxury of not being able to rely on labor. So there's a lot more virtual intelligence that build up, but there is incentive for creativity and problem solving and thinking at a human level. And that's why we get to where we get to. So that's kind of how I think about it, that I do that first. And then from there, you get other questions like, how do we, what does interstellar travel look like? Doesn't look comfortable. How does, what is special about this colony and the reason why Virginia would want to go there, even with the danger of an alias? Well, has really good extradition rules, and it's actually pretty socialistly constructed. So she could get guaranteed work, and she could have a low profile without having to do much. She wouldn't have to do any kind of seedy deals. And then from there, it's like, well, how is something like that structured? How would, what would the government look like? And then from there, grow more and more. So that's usually, I do the plot first, and then from the plot, there are the more important elements of the world. And then from there, what other things would support this structure, or what other cultures are out there that support this kind of structure I'm trying to get to? So, yeah.
So wonderful to hear you talk about your work. I have several questions, but I'm just going to do one at a time. We'll get up.
That's all good.
So this one is not about your work, but it's about science fiction, video games in general. Mm-hmm. So I was introduced over vacation by my son to the Legend of Zelda,
yes,
which is a long-standing game. And he was showing me the new game, and I see this white boy as the sort of playable hero. And I said, well, can't you change his race? Can't you change, because he's showing me all these great, he can have a sword, he can have, wings, he can swim. Well, can you change how he looks? And he's like, no. And I'm thinking, have things changed much? Hopefully, in, video games, science fiction novels. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So there's some, Legend of Zelda has also the unfortunate thing of having a kind of a legacy of always being centered around three certain characters, Link being one of them, Zelda, title character, and then the usual enemy, which is Ganondorf. And this is something that was like cooked up in the 80s to tell a fantasy story in a very short little pixel game. And when they made it back in the day, they took some inspiration from Western mythology, which even though it was written by a Japanese video game developer, they took a little bit of like inspiration from Western elements. So that's going to be a very different situation in a lot of other video games. As time has gone on, there has been more. First, there was more of a, we'll make sure everybody feels like they could play. So there's a lot more games that do what Mass Effect and Dragon Age I mentioned earlier did, which is that you customize your character. So your character can look like whatever you want them to look like, whether it's like you, an idealized version of you, some other character you've cooked up. I find that I never play myself in these games just because it makes it easier for me to separate the story of the character from how I feel, because a lot of times they're going to make choices that you would never find yourself in anyway. But you can make characters that look like you, and therefore there was a little bit. But then there was more recently, there's been more of a commentary of, well, that's still not telling our story, that's just colors, that's palette swapping. So there is, especially in the indie game development sphere, more of a push to have more representation in protagonists, and not just like not just men but women, and not just white but Black and Asian and indigenous North American, or indigenous South American, like all these different backgrounds get to tell their story that's very specific to their culture and their need. I feel like we're approaching this, I don't want to say renaissance, but we are getting better at understanding what that inclusivity should look like and what that means when you're going to be that kind of developer. And that it means telling a story that has a very specifically Black perspective. I cannot think off the top of my head. There is one that is gaining a lot of traction right now. I can't remember, but it is literally like a young Black woman. I want to say it's some sort of like demon hunter, like that's like in this Louisiana bog thing. Stuff like that is happening now. We have a lot of, there's a game that came out recently that had more of a Mesoamerican inspirational twist. It's happening now, and I think that's the better way to approach it. As much as you should still have stories where you can like customize your character and make your hero, it doesn't answer the inclusivity issue. And so now we're getting a lot more people who are able to do that because they have the space to build the games and the stories they want. What's up? Yeah.
You mentioned, if I remember correctly, that at one point you were writing about 1,400 words a day. And I'm just wondering, like, I imagine maybe the amount of time per day that it took to do that varied, but can you give us an idea how much time it took and how you managed to do it if you had other duties, which I assume you did for childcare and maybe employment?
So there's a few different ways I did this. I was still establishing what my position was going to look like at my job, and I got a lot of stuff done at work, and then I'd be bored, so I wrote. So, oopsies, I wrote at work. I never let it supersede my actual work duties, though, so it didn't really interfere with it. But there were days when, unfortunately, at the time, they were kind of underutilizing me, and I was like saying, hey, I have capacity, and like nothing was coming just because of the way things were. So there was like, especially around like December, January, where people were off and had holidays, it was part of the reason I think I finished the first book in a little over a month is because there's a lot of days where I spent 4 hours at work writing. That soon changed, and then so when I had less capacity to make time for it at work, and P.S. told my boss, I was like, hey, when I'm bored, I'm doing this. She goes, that's fine, as long as it's not, and I'm like, no, it will never do that. It's never going to supersede what you're paying me to do. But after that, what ended up happening was a lot more making sure I had time, at least probably an hour, and it was usually very late, and I would write late. There are some indie authors out there who are in a similar position to I, who even have like more kids than I do, who write till 2 a.m, go to sleep and wake up at 6 or 5, and they just lose sleep because they feel that compelled to tell their story. I can't push myself that far, but there were definitely some nights where it got to midnight and I said, I need to stop because now I'm falling asleep at the keyboard. But I had to do it. And also I think something that helps keeping it in the forefront in your brain, or at least for the way that I work, because not every writer can write consistently every day like that. Some people, it's just their brain doesn't work like that. But for me, keeping the idea in my head helps make sure that everything kept moving, even if there were a couple days where I only got a couple sentences out. Like when we buried my grandfather, there was like 3 or 4 days where it was like a couple sentences, that's all I'm doing. But then by the time I was at a better space, paragraphs and paragraphs would be spilling out, and I'd be rushing to get them down before I'd have to go to sleep. And that's pretty much what I made the time. Weekends also, one of the best things was I had a very supportive partner. Mystic was willing to watch our son. We call him Little Buddy in the podcast. He was willing to watch our son. And so he'd be like, do you need 2 hours? Yes, please. Sometimes I'd like ask for 3, and he was like, no, I can only give you 2. Come on now. And we negotiated that because his work is much more independent, and he needs the weekends to work too. So it was a lot of like, making sure I wasn't like invading on his work time, but also asking for, can you give me just a couple hours where I can crank out, this scene or part of this scene? And he obliged. There are also times, there were other activities where I'd have to be, and I'd be writing in the background. But just fit it in wherever I could. So, and that's how we did it. I did it, I should say. Yeah. Thanks.
A lot of drive, my gosh. I have a question about something you mentioned very, very early on at the beginning when you told us you were going to be sticking with your pen name. You used the term parasocial relationship.
Yes.
I've heard that, and I know what that is, but I'm wondering if you can explain for the rest of us, what does that mean, and tell us a little more about your choice to keep your pen name your pen name.
Yeah, so parasocial relationship is the idea that when there is a figure of some sort of prominence and fame, that a lot of times it's about, people who create some sort of, create something that is to be consumed, this happens a lot more as a discussion a few years back on YouTube for YouTube creators, where people would meet their favorite, YouTube creator and say, hey, I love this video and that, and they thought they knew the person, and they would talk about that, and then would be surprised when that person actually turns out to be an introvert and doesn't want to talk to you about like what they've been talking about. The parasocial part is the idea that this person in your mind, because of the way the human brain works, you consider them a friend, and that you know them, and you know a good facet of them, and you have this really deep personal relationship with them, or maybe not even that personal, but you do have a relationship with them, and that person in actuality doesn't have a relationship with you, but you know them through their content. So the idea of essentially, like, I think one of the easiest things is if you're talking about a movie star, say like Scarlett Johansson. You've watched all her films, it's like all her Marvel stuff, you see how she is, and then suddenly you're in a coffee shop in Hollywood and you happen to see her while she's like sipping her latte, trying to have a moment. In a parasocial relationship, if it's not regulated well, you think it's perfectly polite to go there, sit down, and talk about every single movie she's worked on and how much you're a big fan, and try to get more details about, like, well, what was your perspective about doing Black Widow? How was the training? And now you're in the new Jurassic World. What is it like? Did you talk to Spielberg and all this stuff? And feel that you kind of have a right to that because they're your friend in your head. But in reality, Scarlett Johansson just wants to have a coffee. So the one of the things that I think helps with the distance is when you don't go by your real name online. And when I started the podcast with Mystic, that was actually probably the safest way to, kind of to make sure that we had that distance. We also don't show our faces. It's part of the reason I was waiting for that moment when it was going to happen. We also, it's very private. Like, this is how I present myself in public if I'm going to be Sapphy Lore. This is kind of like the first time I'm really doing that. There have been a couple other moments where I've I was here, and I made sure that I was incognito. Wide brim hats are great for that. But Mystic in particular is a super private person, and he doesn't like the idea of anybody really knowing who he is outside of his work. So he doesn't advertise himself. He will never talk in public like this. If we were to do like a live show, if our podcast got really big and we did something like that, we'd be behind a screen. We just want that privacy. Also, when you're raising a child, your child doesn't necessarily want attention from strangers. And to assume that they do is a huge leap. So, you know, for the sake of our son's privacy, we also go by our pseudonyms. And that kind of gives us some protection so that people have a better understanding of this, you know, this version of us. You don't know everything that entails who we are.
2 quick questions. I'll just ask one, sit down and get up again. Have you ever considered screenwriting for film or TV?
Yeah, I don't want to do it. I'm inspired by a lot of movie and filmmaking, but it is a writing style that's very focused on getting the right look. Does it look right? And as much as, you know, I try to, you know, my beta readers, I had 6 beta readers for Hidden Root, by the way, and they were fantastic. They finished the book and gave really good feedback and everything. But when I'm writing a book, and as much as they said they could see and visualize the world that I provided, it is not primarily a book for me that I'm writing for the cinematic appeal of it, the look, the aesthetic, getting a photograph of where you are. I'm there so you can feel deeply with the characters, to be perfectly honest. That's why I write now. So as much as it's important for you to know that, say, that Brave Keeley is like fighting in this onion field in the hilly parts of her town of Fiach, it's more important for you to like feel the inner peace with her as she looks out and she sees the rows of houses and at the beginning of the story, and she has this sense of, this is home and I am comfortable here. And then have that disturbed when her ex-friend with benefits tries to start something again. So like to me, that's the more important part. So like, would I like to assist in screenwriting, especially if it was one of my works? Great, but yes, but I do not want to do screenwriting myself.
Last question, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to,
That's
but
okay.
I'm curious about the origin of your pen name.
Oh yeah, no, I'm happy to answer that. So I will say my birthday is in September, so my birthstone is Sapphire. And one of my earlier pen names I did when I was blogging in college was D20 Sapphire. And so the nickname that came out of that was Sapphy. And then Lore, for Lore Together, like at first it was just Mystic and Sapphy. And Mystics is from his favorite video game, Myst, which I've talked about previously here before. And for us, it just made sense that we would go by the last name Lore, which is funny because in real life I haven't taken his real last name, but instead I feel like Lore is our married name. So we've kind of chose it together, and so he's Mystic Lore and I'm Sapphy Lore, and it just made sense. So, yeah.
Okay, I think I might be the last question.
That's all
Can
good.
you talk about your cover art?
Yes. So for Mother Revolution, I did is it up? No, it's not up. Don't worry about it. So for Mother Revolution, at first I thought there was this artist I wanted to do the cover, and he was really expensive, and I said I don't have the bones for that right now. So and this book has to go out in January, so I'm not going to save up for that. It was like $1,200 for the artist I really liked, which I'm happy to tell you about later. So instead, I went to my friend, his name is Annalie, I thank her in the book, and she's got a lot of like media design and marketing experience, and I told her for Mother Revolution, I said, at the beginning scene, she looks out the window to see this like unearth-like setting. It's like this orange, craggy rock, and then this smoky gray atmosphere. And I said, can you help me do that? I'm thinking about it like this. I let her know. And I did this like very simple mock-up. And she goes, okay, great. She basically went in Canva, did the assets, and we worked on it together. We had a few hours where we essentially worked on how that would look, how you'd make the atmosphere. The above image, the gray part, is actually a picture from the James Webb Telescope, the successor to Hubble, and is so basically used there, and I credit them. And the bottom image is just from Canva, and essentially just try to edit it so that it looked good. But the idea was getting the reader already in the sense of this is what Virginia sees every day and this is what she wants to get away from. She doesn't feel comfortable there. Hidden Roots cover is going to be revealed in probably September, when pre-orders will be ready for the book that comes out November 13th. So, and it's being done, it's almost done. This great artist I met through Gen Con, her name is Sophia DeFelice, and she does print making. And if you saw the title that said Hidden Root, you see that little boar with the purple stripe, that's part of what's going to be on the real cover. She's also doing the art for the lettering on the top, which is not on that bookmark. She's done a couple other features with it, and she's been amazing to work with. I'm so glad I found her. Basically last year at Gen Con, when I decided I didn't want to go with the artist from Mother Revolution, I met her, and I saw her work, and I said, I have to have you for the Injured Tapestry series. She had never done a book cover before, and I told her I really liked her printmaking style. She loves going to like that more 13th century inspired printmaking style, and I'd be happy to share what her portfolio online. It's under crytime.art, if I'm remembering correctly. And I told her I really love it. She picked out one of the animals that's important to the plot, and she kind of highlighted it in a way, and it's very different than what's going on in a lot of fantasy books now, very intentionally, just because there's a lot of stuff that's not traditional Western story-inspired stuff. And yeah, that's where we are with that.
Thank you so much, Sapphy Lore, for inspiring us and sharing with us all the things that inspired you. We really appreciate hearing about your creative process and your books. Very exciting. And I am going to get at my notes here so I can read the announcements, but my phone's locked me out. My finger's too moist. Okay, here we go. All right, we are having a summer sneaker drive through August 24th. For every pair of used gym shoes and sneakers that we collect, Harmony House for Cats, a no-kill shelter in Chicago, will receive a few dollars through a partnership with gotsneakers.com. So bring in your shoes, any condition, any size, but they have to be athletic shoes. And bring them in by August 24th. There's a blue bin in the community room out there to collect them. Our film discussion group will meet again virtually on Monday, July 14th at 7:15. We'll discuss September 5th and Sing Sing, both available on Amazon Prime Video and other streaming services. So for more information or to join the discussion, see John Ungashek or contact the office for the Zoom link. Clearly, I don't know either of those movies. Join fellow makers at the new EHS Crafting Circle on Saturday, July 19th from 2 to 4. We'll enjoy each other's company while working on our own projects, knitting, crocheting, drawing, whatever you like to do. Let's spend time together crafting and sharing conversation. Bring everything you need for your own project and be prepared to clean up yourself, so consider leaving things that are a little messy like glitter at home. Contact Sharon or Kelly if you have questions. Our EHS Writers Group will meet again following the program next week, Sunday, July 20th, in the upstairs conference room. Led by Charlie Sachs, we encourage and support aspiring or experienced writers in the community and cultivate our written expression of the human experience. Newcomers are welcome. And then next week, Sunday, July 20th, join us outside at North Park Village Nature Center, located at 5801 North Pulaski Road in Chicago, for a morning walk. We'll meet at the Nature Center building, which features a discovery room and a hands-on table of natural objects, and then interactive displays, and then we'll take a walk. So there's some mulch and soft surface trails, interesting cultural features, and well-used and much-loved nature play spaces there. Bring your own water, your own snacks, and some sunscreen, a hat, comfy clothes, and walking shoes. And there's plenty of parking available in the parking lot that's right adjacent to it. On Sunday, July 27th, EHS member Katie Merrill will present how current public policies affect people in the real world. Katie is a federal contractor who works closely with staff at the Medicare agency, and she's also an active member of a local mutual aid network that's been providing support to newly arrived refugees and migrants. And so Katie will report from the front lines of both the current administration's approach to governance as well as specific policy initiatives. And she'll reflect on the profound effects that she has seen on individuals who are impacted by these policies, including civil servants and migrants, as well as Medicare program and the City of Chicago. For more details on our upcoming Sunday morning programs and all of our other activities, see our website at ethicalhumanistsociety.org, connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel to see videos of past speakers. And I wanted to close with a couple of words, a reminder that you can scan the QR code for Sapphy's book at the back, and then a closing quote from Albert Einstein, who said, "Imagination is everything. It is the preview of life's coming attractions." So thank you.